Hi there. Okay, I've had a request to do something on firms' objectives. So this particularly centres around the idea of non-profit maximising theories of the firm. But before we get there, let's just think about the standard assumption that we make about firms. And what we assume is that firms want to maximise their profits. We assume an economic theory suggests that the way in which you maximise your profits is producing the output at which MC equals MR. Yeah, so if we take a firm, let's suppose that's its marginal revenue line, that's its output, that's money, and that's marginal cost. Then what neoclassical economic theory assumes is that a firm will want to operate at Q1. And the reason is that this shows the increase or change in revenue, this shows the increase in cost from each unit. What we can see is that each unit adds more to revenue than it does to cost. So all of those units are adding to profit, whereas all ones beyond there would be reducing profit because the extra cost here is more than the extra revenue and profit would start going down. So if a firm wants to maximise its profits, it'll produce where MC equals MR. So why would we assume that a firm wants to maximise its profits? I mean, I guess that sounds like a bit of a stupid question in some ways, but if you were asked, you'd say, well, there are two main reasons that a firm wants profit. One is for reinvestment. The point about profits is that, kind of unlike loans, unlike shares, it's kind of free money. You don't have to pay anybody for using it. Loans from the banks, obviously, you've got to pay interest on those loans and so on. And therefore, that allows you to increase scale. It allows you to innovate. It can link to dynamic efficiency and so on. So there are reasons that, from a practical operational front, firms will want profits. Secondly, the owners of this business are going to want something back. So for example, shareholders, they're going to expect profits. They want to receive dividends. And if you don't pay those dividends, they're likely to sell their shares in the long term, which leads to a reduction in your share price and makes you more vulnerable to take over. So therefore, neoclassical theory has assumed that firms want to make profit. It's a reward for risk. Starting a business is a risky endeavour. You want something back for it. And it seems reasonable in a neoclassical world, at least, that if profit is good, then more profit is even better. And so therefore, we would want to try and maximise it. Now, in reality, that's not necessarily sensible, and it's not necessarily possible. And that's what we need to think about. It might not be sensible because maximising your short-term profit may have issues in the long term. So short-termism, to maximise your short-term profit, for example, what you might do is to decrease research, and that saves you money, or to decrease quality, for example, that saves you money. Or if demand's inelastic in the short term, you might increase your prices. But none of that makes a whole heap of sense, because it's going to, unless you face some sort of short-term emergency, because it's just going to make the business less successful in the long term. But there are also practical issues. So one is kind of philosophical issues that actually is not very sensible. A second issue is it may not really be very easy to maximise your profits, and there are two reasons that might be. There are two reasons that might be the case. If we're going to say difficulties with maximising your profit, then what we can say is that one, there are kind of information difficulties. We're assuming in neoclassical theory that you want to produce where MC equals MR. Fine. But not all organisations know what their marginal cost is. Or indeed what your marginal revenue is. It's actually in practice very, very difficult to calculate. And therefore it may not be as easy as you might think to simply maximise your profits. But in the real world, there is a particular issue with firms maximising their profits. And that's that firms are actually run by managers, but they're owned by somebody else. They're owned by shareholders. There is what's called the divorce between ownership on the one hand, so that's the people who own the business, that's the shareholders, and control, which people who run it, who are the managers. And let's suppose for the sake of argument that those people can't control those people. Let's suppose that the shareholders have difficulties in controlling the managers. Well, why would the managers want to make profits? They don't get it. They may pursue other objectives. So one thing we need to understand is this idea that it may not always be possible for shareholders to control managers. Why not? Kind of three main reasons. Why difficulties controlling managers. Three main reasons. One is that shareholders have no day-to-day control. So as a shareholder, your main access to the business is through the AGM, the annual general meeting, which by definition happens once a year. You're not making day-to-day decisions, and therefore it's very difficult to ensure that a firm is doing what you want it to. Secondly, you've got huge information issues. The information that you get from about the business, by definition, is provided by the business. Therefore, there are significant amounts of information asymmetry. It's highly unlikely they're telling you the whole truth. So therefore, it's very difficult for you to know exactly what's going on. If you don't know what's going on, it's very difficult to make the firm maximise profits. And thirdly, you've got what I sometimes call collective action problems. You have large numbers of small individual shareholders, large numbers, even the bigger organisations, they operate in different sectors across the whole world. They don't necessarily want the same thing. Therefore, getting them to coordinate, to make decisions together can be quite difficult. Although there has been some progress made on that front, and I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. So in reality, it's very difficult for these shareholders to effectively exert control. And as a result, firms may pursue objectives other than profit maximisation. And your syllabus has four main things that it thinks that firms might do instead of maximise profits. One is what it might do is to, so this is alternative theories. That's not going to be legible, is it? This is alternative theories of the firm then. What might a firm do other than maximise its profits? One assumption is that what it might want to do is to maximise sales revenue, or total revenue. So in other words, it might want its revenue, which is P times Q, totally, in other words, total revenue. It might want that to be as high as possible. And that applies to firms where managers are paid on commission. If you're paid a percentage of the revenue, then you want that revenue to be as high as possible. Diagrammatically, this one's fairly straightforward. What you want to do is you want to produce where MR equals 0. Because MR shows the increase in total revenue. So if you're at output Q1, each one of these units along here is adding to revenue. Total revenue is rising all the way until that point. After that point, demand becomes inelastic. Cutting price now leads to a decrease in total revenue. So revenue is falling there. So total revenue would be maximised where MR equals 0. So other things you might want to do, other assumptions, about what the firm might do, are sometimes you just want to be big. So in the early days, of Amazon, what it wanted to do was it wanted to maximise its market share. So market share maximisation or output maximisation. On the syllabus, it calls it market share maximisation. To do that, then what you want to do is produce the biggest you can get, but without making a loss. So again, if that's our assorted curves, anywhere as long as AR is above, as long as average revenue is above average cost, you can make a profit. So if firm's making that output, average revenue is above average cost, and so on, all the way to there. At that output, average revenue equals average cost. Any bigger, and the firm would now start making a loss. But what it has done is to get as much of the market as it possibly can. Other assumptions that you might want to do is, not all organisations are profit maximising at all. So some organisations are, charitable organisations. Wikipedia isn't a profit-driven organisation at all. What they might want to do is to maximise welfare or something. So a third one is social and community objectives. again, whether you would want to show this on a diagram, I don't know. But this is things like charities, like the Mozilla Foundation, that runs Firefox, and those sorts of things. They're clearly not pursuing profit, as an objective at all, really. So the social and community objectives, you could argue that that's the same as being allocatively efficient. I'm not sure they're exactly the same myself, but if you wanted to argue it, then that would be MC equals AR on the diagram. And lastly, some firms simply want to survive. That might be true for new businesses. It might be true for businesses in a recession. Those businesses, they tend to have a very close focus on costs and a very close focus on cash flow. That's what matters to those sorts of businesses. So they're not necessarily thinking about profit, because for example, if you sell things on credit, then you'll have a profit, but you're going to need cash, and it's cash that ultimately puts paid to the business. So the point is that there are these alternative objectives, that a firm might aim to pursue. Those are the four that you need to know, from your syllabus. In terms of whether shareholders can really control managers, there has been, in the last 10 years, a rise in what's been called shareholder activism. Groups of shareholders have been starting to say, well, I'm not actually very happy with big organisations simply paying themselves, paying these managers paying themselves huge salaries, and have started to take more action at annual general meetings. And what they've started to do is to try to appoint their own directors onto the board, to represent their own interests. So in other words, they're actually stopping there from being a divorce between ownership from control, and the owners themselves are taking control. And that's normally via what's called a proxy battle, where at a shareholders meeting, a particular group of shareholders says, we want our representative to sit on the board, and they'll try and win what are called proxy votes, the votes of the shareholders who don't attend the meeting, to say, we're going to look after you. So therefore there has been some sign over the last few years particularly, that organisations are becoming a bit more aligned to the interests of shareholders, and therefore this idea that you can simply do exactly what you want may be less true. One last thing. There's one other branch of theories that says that actually organisations can't maximise anything. And that's because of what are sometimes called stakeholders. And stakeholders are anybody that have an interest in the continued survival of the business. So that might be customers, it might be shareholders, it might be workers, it might be suppliers, it might be the government, and so on. And the point is that we've got to keep all of these different groups happy in the real world. And there's a guy called Simon, that was his second name, it's not me. What he said is that in reality, all firms, what they actually have to do is they have to make compromises. So for example, we can't give customers the lowest possible price because it means we can't pay workers any money. So we have to compromise between these objectives. And what he said, he described that as satisficing. So the idea is we make satisfactory profit for shareholders. We give satisfactory wages to workers. We give satisfactory to price and quality to customers. So hence we have to compromise. And that's that idea of satisficing theory.